people in the waiting room. Welcome back, everyone. As we are letting people in, take this opportunity to say I hope you had a chance to take some lunch, and we are coming back for the second plenary session of the first day of our Evidence for Action conference. So thank you for returning. My name is Fiona Hurd. I'm the Programme Manager for SSRP, and I'm the Technical Facilitator for this, this session. Welcome. Reminding you of the house rules. So yeah, please do use your full name and affiliation in Zoom. As before with the previous sessions, if you attended, or if this is your first session, then please put all of your questions into the chat box. If you have any technical issues, please put them in the chat box as well, and we will try and deal with them as best we can. You have been muted automatically on entering this meeting, and we ask you to remain muted, please. And a reminder that this session will be recorded. And I am going to just give you a reminder of the session we're in now, the second plenary, and it is my pleasure to hand over to the chair for this session and my colleague, Anne Roemer-Mahler. So over to you, Anne.
Thank you, Fiona. Welcome, everyone, to the second plenary session for today, and particularly warm welcome to Helena Molin-Valdes, our speaker for today. As you see on the program, we had two speakers planned initially, but unfortunately, Professor Okereke from Nigeria isn't able to join us, at least so far. He might still be able to join us a bit later, but if not, we just go ahead and have just a bit more time for Helena's talk. Fiona has done the housekeeping, so there's not much more to add, other than perhaps saying that if you would like to tweet about the session, please use the hashtag Evidence for Action and the Twitter handle at SSRP OUS or the EFA 2021. Okay, so welcome. Oh, and thanks, Amy, for pasting these two hashtags and handles in the chat. So welcome very much, Helena Molin-Valdes, our speaker for today and for the session. Helena was the head of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition Secretariat from 2013 to just recently. And CCAC, for those of you who don't know it, is a partnership of governments, of businesses, scientific institutions, and civil society working on improving air quality and protecting the climate. And before Helena worked for the CCAC, she also worked for the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and before that for the Pan American Health Organization, which I was particularly interested in because myself, I'm Anne Roemer-Mahler, the chair of the session, and my background is not in environmental politics, but in global health politics. So thank you very much for inviting me to chair the session. It's my pleasure. And without any further ado, I hand over to Helena, who will be speaking about the international policies that are able to jointly protect climate and health. Over to you, Helena.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to keep my notes short. It's always difficult for me. I want to make a few reflections on those existing policies, mainly the Paris Agreement and the links to the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. I've been myself for more than 25 years now working in the UN system. I left a few months ago. So my experience has come a lot from working with countries and policymakers around these issues of risk, resilience, climate, and sustainable development. It's a lot of interesting encounters to learn from. So I wanted to emphasize also in my talk what you already said a little bit, that it's not only carbon dioxide as that is the main climate forcer. There are also powerful short-lived climate pollutants that, if they are reduced fast, can help to reduce the rate of warming in the near term, and also then reduce air pollution with a lot of health benefits for millions of people and increasing crop yields. And this is also linked to household energy and burning of biomass and fuels, etc. So it's a lot of linkages to many of the Sustainable Development Goals and the poverty alleviation agenda. So I just wanted also, before I started, I wanted to quote our Secretary General in the UN, Antonio Guterres, was just re-elected for another period. Now, I found it interesting to just go back because this is also very much the UN Environment Program agenda where I used to work. And Antonio Guterres said when he took his second term now, made it crystal clear about the so-called triple planetary crisis, which is climate change, nature loss, and pollution. And I think this is definitely as a basis for what we're going to discuss in this symposium over these 3 days. It's the #1 existential threat, he said, and we need an urgent all-out effort to turn things around. And of course, all these planetary change challenges and capabilities are very much underlining our success or not to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, heat waves in Europe and Siberia and the struggle now in Germany with floods is just symptoms of this, the connection between nature loss, climate change, and pollution for that matter. So a few numbers: biodiversity is declining at an unprecedented and alarming rate. Every year we lose 10 million hectares of forests. This is contributing to the issues. Inequalities remains at unsustainable levels. The pandemic on top of this has crippled economies and increased inequalities and pushed further 124 million people into extreme poverty. So we are not advancing, and it's not only because of the pandemic, but it puts it on its toes. And still, in the meantime, we have the net worth of some 2,500 billionaires that increased by over $5.2 billion per year their wealth during the pandemic. Just put this in context of the needs of finance for what we are discussing in this webinar and this symposium. So awareness is high right now that we need systemic changes, but are people really willing to accept this? And are politicians and decision makers bold enough to take such decisions? Is the private sector stepping up? So that's just the context. So we have already many international policies and agreements that could help us to overcome these challenges. So next slide, just for illustration. So I will speak mainly about the Paris Agreement. And the Sustainable Development Goals. I think you have gone through that already this morning, but let me just try to get to my next so 2015 was really the big highlight of the community. Let's say the spirits were very high. We approved the Sustainable Development Goals after many years of negotiations in the General Assembly and with an involvement of many stakeholders across the globe through UN system, through national and local efforts. And it followed on the Millennium Goals that was adopted in 2000. The big difference between the Millennium Goals and the Sustainable Development, the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, which has its goals and it also has its indicators for monitoring and progress reporting, is that the SDGs is universal. It's for all countries. And it also aims to zero hunger, no poverty. It's like an ambitious agenda to get rid of, to improve the livelihoods and the lives of the people of the planet by 2030. It's a hugely ambitious agenda, but the purpose is to improve the planetary and human health for everybody through partnerships with climate action on sustainable consumption and production, and an equality within a whole equality backing. This is something that really is a difference from how it has been spoken about in the past. And that takes me to the Paris Agreement and the UN UNCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted in '92, and then with a protocol in '97, the Kyoto Protocol, which was very much about common but differential responsibilities and respective capabilities, and divided countries into Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries, the developed countries and developing countries, or industrialized countries and developing countries. So this is, of course, because of history and who is responsible for climate change and the big CO2 emissions that has mainly been the consequence of industrialization, which was an important differentiation at the time. During the Kyoto Protocol in '97, established the objectives and the targets, binding targets for developed countries, the Annex 1 countries, to reduce emissions. And the difference now with the Paris Agreement is that we have a universal agreement, which is for everybody, and that it's focusing on nationally determined contributions to achieve the necessary and the common target and goal, which is set out in the Paris Agreement, to not increase or to limit the increase in the global average temperature to stay way below the 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And this 1.5 degrees was very much the assistance of developing countries and the small island developing states, who definitely cannot survive with an increasing temperature above 1.5 degrees, despite IPCC and other scientific advisors pointing out that with the current climate budget, this is almost an impossible task. And there was a special report from IPCC that came out 2 years ago, which outlines what needs to happen for the 1.5 degree to be a reality. And it's not happening right now. And it does include a huge amount of radical changes in our production style, in our consumption styles, and in the way that industry and transport is taking place. And of course, it's very much linked to a fossil-free energy provision, which is not something easy to achieve, as we all know. We do have a lot of countries that have stepped up and set out net zero carbon targets for 2050. But the question is, will this be achieved? And is there enough alternatives and political will to do the necessary changes? So these are questions to be stated. The important part and in the slide here, if you look at the Eiffel Tower, where I used to live just beside the Eiffel Tower before I moved to my new life here in Spain, the Paris Agreement was, as I mentioned, the strong difference between before and now is that it's based on national determined contributions from all countries and pledges that are supposed to be increasingly more ambitious and reviewed every 5 years. The 2020 was the year to be revised the first time, and where many countries have indeed worked on new ambitions. As we all know, this was postponed, and the COP26 in Glasgow did not take place last year. And now in November is the new deadline for this 2021. So we are already 1 year behind schedule, let's say, on the reviews. And then the intention also is to enhance all these other sister agreements. I've mentioned before the Kigali Amendment. The Kigali Amendment is to control and reduce the introduction of the hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, for cooling and refrigeration as an alternative to the ozone-depleting substances under the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol is an agreement, one of the most successful agreements in the UN, because they indeed have since I think it was adopted in '87, and with the purpose of reducing the ozone-depleting substances to protect and recover the ozone layer around the globe. And by now, it has achieved its objectives. So this is a very good mark, and it was a lot of industrial and private sector engagement and financing being provided as well for countries and companies to phase out the ozone depleting substances to others less damaging. And one of those other substances and chemicals that was introduced in refrigeration and cooling, which is not ozone depleting, was the HFCs, the hydrofluorocarbons. So the negative part of this is, of course, that HFC is a very powerful climate forcer. And you solve one problem and you create another. So this is something, therefore, that the Montreal Protocol parties were interested in discussing, and there took many years as well to get to an agreement that under the Montreal Protocol, the purpose was to achieve this phase down of hydrofluorocarbons, and by cutting the production and consumption and introducing alternatives to both the ODS, the ozone depleting substances, and to HFCs. And they set an agenda. It was finally adopted in 2016, so a year after the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. And it has now been ratified by 100 countries. So for it to come into force, it needed 20 parties to ratify it. And we are now having more than 100. So that is very good. The little bit downside on this is that the goal was to achieve 80% reductions in HFC consumption by 2047. That's almost mid-century. And of course, many people and many countries would like to see this happening much faster. And this could be an important element to also reduce global warming and to stick to the Paris Agreement. So basically, the HFCs are being controlled now under a very successful protocol, which is the Montreal Protocol in the Kigali Amendment, and it's being reported as part of the emissions inventories and emissions in the UNFCCC under the convention and now the Paris Agreement. And one thing that we were promoting a lot, and we are promoting a lot, is to make sure that when the national determined contributions under the Paris Agreement are being developed by countries, that they take a hard look also on their projection of HFCs. And of course, refrigeration and cooling is going to be a huge health issue moving forward, especially in a warmer climate and during those type of scenarios that we are already living every year now. We have seen the 5 hottest years in history already now, and with the 48 degrees in Siberia and Canada that we saw a few weeks ago coming our way, and looking at India and other countries where the heat peaks are huge. The cooling signifies a huge amount of energy consumption, and it also signifies now the release of climate forcing substances. So the connection is there, and other sister agreements include, of course, those linked to improving the emissions standards in the flight sectors with ICAO and the International Maritime Organization, who just a few years ago adopted a shipping emission protocol, where they also look at black carbon and improved fuels. This will lead to higher costs. And here comes a completely different conversation that I'm not going to go into, but something that is constantly, I can come back to consumption and production a lot, because in the end, what we do as consumers is that we buy stuff across the globe using Amazon and other things like this, and we might not be so aware of the shipping footprint that we help contribute to in this endeavors of consuming cheaply. So when we talk about putting a price to carbon, we should also be putting price on other emissions and other climate forcing and polluting substances from these sectors. So this is just a little kind of tick off for ourselves, but also looking at the European climate law that is being discussed right now. One of the controversial issues in that law has been the suggestion of putting tariffs on those third countries or outside the European Union countries products that haven't complied with the emission standards of the European Union. And this is, of course, something that many countries outside the European Union are now complaining about because it looks like protectionist. So I think it's an interesting debate to behold moving forward, and maybe not right now.
2 or 3 more minutes.
Yes. Okay, let's go quickly to next. I told you that I was going to be lengthy when I speak. In any case, I just want to make the point that climate and air pollution is like we have one atmosphere, and we are on an unsustainable path on this. So currently, if you look at warming, we have 1.2 degrees warming already since pre-industrial times, with the carbon dioxide concentrations at the highest level in 3 million years. Air pollution is the greatest environmental threat to human health, and it has also more proven links now to the spread of virus, something that many researchers are looking into. 7 million premature deaths per year from air pollution, and many other health problems, just to mention a few that you can see in the slide there. 36% of deaths from premature deaths from lung cancer can be linked to air pollution. 34% of deaths from stroke can be linked to air pollution. 27% of death from heart disease. It's quite a lot. And then when it comes to, and there is also a lot of other ways of looking at hospital hours and development of fetus, etc., that is linked now to air pollution. And the third point here is the link to crops and agriculture in terms of impact, especially from tropospheric ozone. More than 100 million tons basic crops are lost every year due to tropospheric ozone. And this, of course, is strongly linked to the zero hunger objective goal of the SDGs. Next. So define a more sustainable path. And I mentioned in the beginning that it's not only about the end game of 1.5 or well below 2 degrees, it's also how we get there. Because with the CO2 focus alone, or the long-lived climate forces alone, there will not be a bending of the curve during the next couple of decades. And this is what's needed if we are to avoid irreversible tipping points due to this warming. And we have roughly 1.6 degrees that could be reduced in the next 20 years if we use technically available solutions to reduce black carbon from incomplete combustion, methane, hydrofluorocarbons that I mentioned. And this could definitely happen. And that's what I wanted to speak a little bit more about. So if you go to next.
1 more minute, Helena.
Sorry. Yes. So the short-lived climate pollutants, you can look at this later. They are short-lived. Black carbon is particulate matters, and it lives a week in the atmosphere, and it's not a mixed gas, and it's also more localized. Methane, HFCs, are like CO2, a mixed gas, and they are global, and HFCs 15 years, methane 12 years. And of course, there is a lot of other linked up impacts that we can also discuss in a different context when it comes to the SDGs from this. So we have set some targets that if you reduce black carbon to 70%, methane to 45%, and hydrofluorocarbons by 56% by 2030, this will be consistent with the 1.5 degree scenario. And it's very much possible based on the existing technologies, as I said. Next. So that's the multiple benefits pathway. It's about avoided global warming by 2050. I'm not going to go into this. We can go to next. So I wanted to say a few words on methane, because there has been in the public eye now more and more information around methane. Just before I left my job in April, the CCC with the UNEP, UN Environment Program, launched a global methane assessment. And methane is increasing much more than, you can go to next slide. So methane is increasing much more than CO2 right now. The atmospheric concentration is increasing more than any time in the observational record. Human activity is causing methane concentration to rise rapidly. And this is really threatening the achievement of global climate targets. And this is not reflected as it should in many of these national determined contributions. And also many of the sectors, we have the biggest contribution is from the oil and gas sector. So it's much better to burn natural gas than to burn fossil fuel from oil and coal. But on the other hand, if the gas is released into the atmosphere, which happens many times during the production line and during the distribution of this gas, it's actually much more climate forcing. It's important to keep track of this, because it does have huge implications on the temperature. It also has huge implications on health, because methane is a precursor to tropospheric ozone, and we just saw the numbers of impact of tropospheric ozone on health and premature death and crop yields. So there are very concrete actions and technologies and practices in agriculture, in waste management, in the fossil fuel industry that could be implemented sometimes with zero net cost, or at pretty low investment costs, especially compared to what it costs to not doing anything. And all of this you could find much more detail in the Global Methane Assessment, which also has a tool, an online tool, where you can check all the available technologies and all the available data and compare health impact, warming aspects, and based on each of these policy and technological solutions, plus the costs. And that's quite an important measure for policymakers to take into account. Next. So few words on not only the agreements and the official agreements and the binding agreements that have an impact. They often take very long to negotiate, and there is also a need for these voluntary commitments, which also helps the formal agreements to actually create trust and also to create, let's say, the examples of what can be done in terms of practical implementation. It also involves private sector, industry, and civil society in a way that's impossible during the negotiations for the more binding agreements. So the Climate and Clean Air Coalition is such a coalition, and the only one that actually has focused over the last 10 years on the short-lived climate pollutants and the interface between climate and clean air. And it's very much, you can go to next, it's very much an action partnership. I think it's 75 countries and another 75, 80 international organizations. Most of the UN agencies and many of the development banks are participating, and also hundreds of cities and other private sector entities. It has a scientific advisory panel that actually Joe Alfamo was part of setting up back in his times when he was at UNEP. And through this scientific panel, we have been able to constantly build the scientific underpinning results that could help these actions, and also to contribute to the IPCC assessments and many other of the agreements that I was mentioning before. And the big part of the coalition and the interesting part of the coalition has been to focus on the solutions and to implementation at scale to reduce methane, black carbon, and HFCs, especially in household area on black carbon, and to reduce the sulfur content in diesel, which is the biggest contributors to black carbon, to avoid open burning. And then in the agriculture field, which is always has been the biggest difficult sector to deal with in the climate change context, because farmers and agriculture is key for food security, and therefore quite difficult for them and to engage, let's say, as being blamed for something like global warming, because as we know, most of the methane emissions come from agriculture sector, from ruminants, rice paddies, and also manure management. So there is solutions there, and what we have done, we have worked with these 70 countries to implement specific norms, normative action, assessments, national planning, and also practical implementation in the waste sector, testing cooling, new alternatives for cooling, for example, which helped to get the Kigali Amendment off the ground. Working with the oil and gas sector to introduce standards and measures for them to take action to reduce the leaking and venting of emissions. And now also starting to work more on the finance to get be part of the financial schemes.
Helena, I need to ask you to wrap up now, please. Otherwise,
yes, I have the last slide now. Just a few.
Literally only half a minute, please.
Yes. So there is a list. It's about some of the conclusions, and my experience over these 25 years has been to focus on the scientific evidence and the integrated assessments. And since we talk here about SDGs and climate, this is a really important point to look at the benefits of all of these different integrated policies, to international agreements are essentials, but also remember they take time, and they should not be the only ones to focus on, even though they send very strong market signals for change. The political will, of course, is lacking, as I said in the beginning, and the governance and normative actions are key to implementation and involving people. All the marches and the youth movement right now, I think, is a very strong indication in a positive way that people are starting to get involved. But it also, you have the opposite as well, where people are very much against some of these restrictions. Awareness and public education, therefore critical. And then there is a lot to be said about setting price on carbon. And I'm just going to add that carbon should also include methane and maybe even black carbon. And finally, on the finance side, cooperation and solidarity, nothing is yet enough. And the 100 billion that was set out as a target within UNFCCC for the Green Climate Fund is far from fulfilled yet. So here you find a few of the links just for yourself to read a bit more about these things that I spoke about. And I like this quote of Albert Einstein that Johan Brockström has used quite a few times in his discussions with the climate policy makers. So world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing. And there are still too many doing nothing in our own homes and in our own environment to help achieve both the sustainable development goals and the climate objectives. Remember that there are always some restrictions and there are some costs to being more equal in the world. And I think this is the big learning that we should take away from this seminar, that we need to look at both North and South, and within our own countries as well. There's a lot of inequalities that needs to be addressed before we can achieve this agreement.
Helena, thank you very much also for the rather inspiring last few words. I'm really pleased that Professor Okereke has been able to join us, our second speaker. I hope I can.
Yeah, I'm still on.
Super, brilliant. So yeah, fantastic that you're here. Helena, thank you very much for this really an interesting talk at the beginning. Because we are a bit further in our time than I had planned to, can I suggest that those of you who have clarifying questions to Helena, take note of them and perhaps ask them in the discussion session after Professor Okereke has spoken. Just very briefly, and to not lose more time, Professor Okereke is a professor of global environmental and climate governance at the Alex Ekwueme Federal University in Nigeria. And perhaps without further ado, could I hand over to you? Yeah.
Yes. Remind me, Anne, how much time I have, please.
Yeah, so if you could speak for about 15 minutes until about 1:20, that would be great. That would leave us with 25 minutes for Q&A.
Is that because you took my time and gave to Helena?
No.
No time. There's no time trading here. But okay, thanks very much. I will try and keep it very brief. I'm sorry I'm not able to switch on my video because I'm trying to save bandwidth. I have been having internet challenges this morning. Very, very awful timing. But I think I've managed to find a solution that can hopefully last to the end of this session. So here is my thesis. My thesis is quite simple. I'm speaking on the political economy of sustainable transformations and the green economy. And Helen has said quite a lot of things that I agree with and sets the session up quite nicely for some of the things I want to say. So my thesis is quite simple. And here it is. The science is settled decidedly in favor of the need for urgent action. The problem we have is not the lack of awareness, because our awareness is broad, although in some areas not as deep as one would expect. But we have, broadly speaking, a high level of awareness on the need to act on the issue of sustainability. I think also that the technical competence to act is there. We have the technological tools to act. And we have enough money to address this problem. Therefore, why is it that we have not made as much progress as one would naturally expect or would expect in a situation where the science is decidedly settled in favor of the need for global transformation or transition? I would not waste time to discuss the possible difference between those two words because of time, but if one wanted, we could get into it. So, but why is it that we don't still have the urgency? And my thesis is that the main reason for the drag is politics. It's the politics of interest. It is the nature of the international and national political economic system, the system of ownership of production, the system of incentives, the system of rewards. And these politics come to a head when one examines it, or it crystallizes quite neatly when one examines it from the prism of justice, equity, and fairness. So we have different dimensions of justice and inequity characterizing the system, making it difficult for the sort of action that one would require to take place. The need for sustainable transformation, as I said, is not in doubt. Since 2005, the per capita emissions between countries, even at similar stages of economic development, has varied by a factor of 3, showing there is no immutability between economic development and welfare. So this can potentially be decoupled because we have, again, as I said, countries at similar economic development varying significantly in terms of their per capita income. And also there are huge variations in responsibility for emission, even on consumption basis. Crucially, despite growing climate mitigation policies around the world, the cumulative GHG emissions globally continue to rise, underlining the urgency of mitigation challenge. Deepak, some noise is coming from you. Interfering. Thank you for muting. Since the last five years or so, global emissions continue to increase, even though more slowly, but I think still on the average of 2.2% per year. There was, of course, a dip because of COVID, but things are beginning to also pick up. And the accumulation of impact of climate change will get worse without stronger mitigation challenge. The total contribution of the pledges from the NDC show that we are not in anywhere near meeting the 1.5 Paris goal. And Helena talked about the fact that the situation is also quite daunting and challenging. It's not looking good when you look at many other indices, for example, biological diversity, which continues to decrease globally. World's forests is diminishing. Water levels globally is diminishing. And population continues to be on the rise. Now, the impact of these environmental degradation is not equally felt across the world. According to statistics, there may well be up to 1.2 billion people that will be displaced by climate change by 2050. But 80% of this population is projected to be from the poor developing countries, poor countries around the world. And both in historical and current terms, the responsibility for climate change is not equal across countries. In fact, as of today, it takes an average Malian 1 year to emit as much carbon as an average American will emit in 2.3 days. That is 1 year versus 2.3 days. On top of this, of course, we've had COVID that is pushing nearly 25 million extra people into poverty in Africa. So, and of course, we have pledges like the adaptation, 100 billion long-term and 30 billion short-term, which is not resulting into significant transfer to poor countries. So for example, in Africa, we still have an adaptation gap of nearly 15 billion per year. So there is a challenge in translating this settled science broad awareness, technical to action on the ground. And as I've postulated before, the reason can be found in the current economic structure, the political, and what are the key things that are driving the current political economy of the system. And it seems to me that we need to look at the hegemony of the capitalist ideology, the dialectic relationship between the historic blood and the subordinate classes, and the relationship between the material realm and the ideational realm. And so even though there are some sorts of disagreements about how the world is going to develop, the future of the world, consensus and alliances that define the politics often still result perpetually of the capitalist idea and those in the ruling bloc. And the domination is less rooted in coercion, but it's rather political control is rooted in the institutions of the society, which play a central role in ideological reproduction, the assertion of moral and intellectual leadership, and of course, the projection of a particular set of interests as the general interest. And so we see from Helen's presentation, for example, that despite the decimation that we face as a result of poverty and COVID, the number of people that have become billionaires and their wealth have increased in the past 5 or so years. View, there is no need to assert that everything else, of course, derives from economic structural forces or that ideational superstructures are mere reflections of the economic base, because moral legitimacy plays a powerful role. And this is the challenge I even have when I talk to people in developing countries and say, look, do you realize that you don't necessarily need to subscribe to the same type of economic system or structural order that provided or that caused this unsustainability that we are facing? Everyone, or nearly everyone, wants to be like the West because we have defined the good life, economic well-being, as, you know, in terms of a particular type of lifestyle, which is basically in line with accumulation and more accumulation and more accumulation. And I would like to posit that there is a fundamental, almost irreconcilable tension between the need for more and more accumulation and the need for sustainability, even though at a sort of superficial level, this decoupling of economic growth and sustainability can be somewhat achieved. But such an achievement is merely tentative, and without challenging the structural form that rewards accumulation, it's going to be difficult to solve this problem. And again, it is those that are, if you like, in the lower rungs of economic ladder, whether in the nation or internationally, that tend to bear the greatest brunt. And so we see, for example, in Africa, about $67 billion of illicit trade, 4.2 times greater than the FDI, the foreign direct investment, 3.4 times greater than the money Africa gets from the OECD, and 2 times greater than the total amount of loans that Africa gets. And yet there is no commitment, both international, especially from international forces, to combat the problem of illicit transfer. If you take another figure, the profit that is repatriated by the multinational companies in Africa, 32.4 billion per annum, which is 2 times greater than the FDI and 1.69 times greater than OCDI, and nearly 0.9 times greater than the loans. Africa continues to wallow in a huge, clearly unsustainable debt, which has been exacerbated by COVID. In Nigeria, where I come from, for example, we have a situation where up to 70% of income the country gets is used to service debts. And talks that there has to be some kind of debt cancellation, maybe tied to particular activities or investments, continue to meet with strong resistance. Globally, we still have about 150 billion or so spent on subsidizing fossil fuel and only a fraction spent in subsidizing renewable energy technology. I celebrate the fact, of course, that the prices of some renewables are coming low, but it has to be understood that access to those renewable technologies is not equal, it's not cheap. And so we need to pay attention to the political economy of the system, both at national and international level. Otherwise, it will seem to me that even if we manage to achieve some kind of transformation, it will not be just. There is a close linkage between, climate mitigation, sustainable development, and achieving the SDGs. The literature shows that the risks and co-benefits of mitigation action, for example, vary from country to country and depends on the ability of countries to respond to mitigation and to the challenge. And that this has quite a lot to do with the stage of industrial development and national capabilities of countries. And yet, many countries in the South do not have the liberty to choose the development trajectory and pathways that they can follow because of the international structural conditions. After all, in the entirety of Africa, less than 12 companies account for 75% of the mining activities and reparation of profit from Africa. And so we need
two more minutes, if you please.
Oh, you are insisting on the time trade. No problem. It's fine. So in conclusion, one needs to understand that it may serve the West good, well, to kind of treat the needs of Africa and other poor countries glibly, or their need and their claim for justice glibly. But I am sounding a note of warning that the battle for climate change is going to be won or lost in these countries. And so, because these are the countries that are going to be, and I think, morally right to pursue their economic growth. And these are the countries where you have the greatest increase in population. By 2030, 9 countries, including India, Nigeria, Ethiopia, DRC, US, will account for 50% of the global population. India, China, Nigeria, some of the MENA countries are where you may well expect to see the greatest increase in, for example, CO2 emissions. And yet, the conversation on just transformations are happening without the active participation and collaboration with of these countries. And even, for example, the discourse of net zero is kind of happening somewhere in the West and virtually imposed on Africa without understanding our socio-political context. We must take or pay strong attention to the political economy in order to get the transition right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, also for sticking to the time so diligently. That was great, and I'm really fascinated to listen to these talks. As I said at the beginning, my field is global health and not environmental governance, but a lot of what I hear from you really resonates also with my area of work. Just perhaps a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, please do type them in the chat. We've already got one, but perhaps we can collect a couple of more questions to the speakers. But perhaps while you sort of think about this, I have like two themes that I hear from both of you really resonate with my own work. One is that in a way that the science seems to be reasonably clear, the scientific evidence for the link between climate change, air pollution and health and poverty, or the link between the SDGs and at the sort of scientific and technical level. But the sticking point seems to be implementing those insights and this evidence into politics. And again, something that is very familiar from my own work, and the pandemic we're currently living through is just one example. And the other theme I heard from both of you is there seems to be a bit of a tension here between policies and goals devised at the so-called global level, and questions about to what extent we are talking actually about a globality here, about a global or actually a much more confined sort of geographical space. But then also a tension between those goals and policies and sort of local and country level initiatives. So perhaps that would be something, if we have time, I would be really curious to hear more of your thoughts about these two themes between sort of having quite clear evidence at the scientific level, but having problems with implementing this politically. And on the other hand, this sort of tension between the so-called global and the sort of country or local level. But before that, maybe let me highlight two questions we've had from the chat. One is from Pete Newell here at Sussex, who asked whether you could say more about where you think that the cracks are and the opportunities perhaps also lie in challenging elite power and control of resources to achieve a more sustainable future. So Pete asks, what are the cracks, but also where could be the opportunities in challenging elite power and the control of resources? And another question that comes from Net Pakai, there's been a bit of a conversation in the chat, but I'll post a question anyway for those of you who haven't read the chat. Net asked whether there are any international policies or agreements that prevent effects of ecosystem management or water management of a nation, that prevents effects of that on other nations. And again, Helena, you've already answered, but maybe you and also perhaps Professor Okereke could say something about that. So who would like to start with their thoughts? Helena, would you like to start?
Yes, maybe just starting with the last one, which was a bit quicker. So the water and ecosystem management, as to my knowledge, there is no real convention or agreement that can impose anything from one nation to another. There is a UNECE in the European Central Asia region, quite a good one, which is linked to health and water management. There is a wetland Ramsar agreement, protect wetlands, and there is Joe also mentioned two other ones on the UN Watercourse Convention, which is linked to rivers, and the other one is on the Global Agreement on Marine Pollution from land-based sources. Water is always an extremely sensitive issue, and there are many conflicts, as we know, between countries because of use of water. The Nile, many of the big rivers in the world. So it's not an easy issue, but it's definitely a very important one. So no straightforward answer there. On the themes that you mentioned on science, I think it's reasonably clear. I think all the conventions, and there's a lot of very excellent science panels and assessments, IPCC being the biggest one on climate, but there are many others as well. On biodiversity, there is an excellent one as well. Health, and WHO has very, very clear guidelines and good scientific. There's the Lancet studies. There's many. I would agree with you. The problem is to act on science. One of our scientists, Drew Shindell, who led the methane assessment, and he's also the chair of our scientific advisory panel for the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. He just said that when he was in the government in NASA, he was always called in to give his pitch, and then he had to leave the room. So I think that's maybe what many scientists feel frustrated about, that the evidence might be there, but policymakers seem to have difficulty in keeping them close and actually, taking in what's being said. So I think that's the big problem. And secondly, the sticking point you mentioned on implementation, as I mentioned, and also Chuck mentioned, it's very much about power and short-term gains and difficult. Politicians and policymakers seem to have difficulties in taking decisions that can meet some oppositions, and there will always be opposition when you try to restrict anything, whatever it is, if it's about wealth or taxes, or if it's about higher fuel standards or switching from one technology to another. It will always be people who lose out. For example, there's the discussion on plastics, and I was in India and we discussed this, and of course, how many millions of people live out of creating plastic bags. So you ban plastic bags, you suddenly get rid of millions of livelihoods. So it's whichever topic you take, there will always be need for kind of finding alternatives, and I think that's kind of impeding implementation. And then of course, the financial incentives for industry and the private sector to actually invest in alternatives is also an important point that in the Montreal Protocol function very well, because there the incentives and the finance went hand in hand with science and with implementation of the phase out of the ozone depleting substances. Maybe that's something we can learn from. Over to Chuck. I'm sure you have good answers to this.
Yes, over to you, Chuck.
Thanks very much. And the question that was posed by Peter is where the cracks are and how those cracks may represent opportunities for challenging the elite power and control of resources to achieve sustainable transformation. But if he didn't ask this question, I would have been citing his work copiously to try and provide an answer, because the opportunity lies very much in some kind of alternative coalitions that could challenge the hegemonic forces. And in my experience, a veritable crack is actually between companies themselves, between renewable energy, for example, companies and non-renewable energy companies. Because one of the reasons why we have this fall in renewable energy technologies have been, in part, the entrance of new players in the field that rose quite dramatically to challenge the orthodoxy, the kind of more hegemonic actors, and show in some aspects or areas that it's actually possible to provide the services that these other fossil fuel industries provided in a cheaper way in some areas. And that took the rug, if you like, off the feet of the renewable and the fossil fuel industries that argued vociferously, as it were, that this cannot be done. But somehow, because of their structural forces and power, they continue to be able to corral quite a huge amount of subsidies. But I think now that there is also a decided shift in discourse, and many of them are beginning to realize that their business plan is unsustainable and beginning to rebrand. For example, BP saying it's beyond petroleum, and Total talking about Total Energy. But the job is not done because we see that whenever there is any opportunity, these oil companies kind of still like to go back to what they know best, and to their vested interest. And I see another crack in, or possible coalition in the role of the growing role of the youth taking action. And this has actually, as Helena said, no politician wants to. Many of them, if you talk to them privately, they tell you how much they like to implement sustainable development policies. But politically, some of those policies are costly for them, and they are always thinking about the next election. I can't forget a highly placed UK politician telling me that, saying, Chucks, if I did all of these things that you're asking me to do, I wouldn't be in power long enough to implement them. So, and I also remember my conversation with a very highly placed chief executive of an oil company that said, oh, we can actually slap $100 price of carbon and get everything going renewable in the next couple of years, but who will be prepared to pay the price? And when I pointed to him that actually that question is a bit cheeky, because that they continue to take away billions in profit. And he turned around and said to me that, oh, the problem is not about the company, the problem is about the shareholders that make a certain demand on the companies. And that if that company A were to pay less to its shareholders and waive frantically their certificate of cleanliness, that many of the people, the shareholders, will willingly invest in another company that is paying more, but investing in dirty fuel. So the public consciousness also have to shift. And that is where people like you and I, Pete, can still play a more role. The intelligentsia, as you have written, comprises not only of the work of academics, but of the preachers, the laymen, the institutions that are actually perpetuating a kind of, certain definitions, if you like, of the good life. And this is the biggest challenge that most people I know and I interact with continue to think that they have to have certain kinds of things or use things in certain kind of ways in order to be seen to be living the good life. And so we need to challenge that in order to make meaningful progress. I hope that helps, but I'm sure that you can do even better than myself, Pete, in answering that question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was great. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? Please do type in the chat. Perhaps, like, following on from this, I was wondering, and taking sort of Pete's and your point further, in terms of where a challenge could come from to what you describe as sort of the hegemony, where a challenge could come from both at the political economy level, the business model level, or even the sort of the narrative, the ideational level. I was wondering if you could say, perhaps both of you, if you see any opportunities here arising from the increasing power and also political power, economic power, technological power of organizations, both public and private, from middle power countries, from Asia, but also from Africa, where we see international organizations, civil society organizations, but also companies emerging, who increasingly take part in these sort of so-called global debates. So basically my question to both of you, but specifically to you, Professor Okereke, is whether you see a constructive challenge potentially arising from those quarters.
I'm sorry, no, I do not see that eventuating to anything meaningful or significant. I speak, for example, from Africa. Africa continue to have very limited impact in the global discussions on how to solve the global environmental challenges and climate change in particular. I know of 2 or 3 African countries that have already been refused a significant amount of loan requests to expand their natural gas. These countries made a request for loan on the basis that gas will be their transition, framed as a transition fuel. Now, although if you follow very strictly the climate change model, the refusal of such loans may be justified because all the models show that we have limited room for further investment in gas. But the perfidy of it is that another country is not making the decision for another country on how and where it can make investments. And already, despite the fact that these 3 countries that I am very familiar have loan requests rejected, have huge rates of energy poverty, where, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, you have just about 40 to 50% connection to modern energy. And in rural areas, up to 80% continue to use dirty fuels to cook, charcoal, dung, and wood to cook. But in a way, there is now a gas embargo on Africa. And yet these countries have huge amount of gas reserve. And part of the challenge is also that a few weeks ago, I was in the UK. I think I continued, if I remember correctly, I was heating my house with gas. And some of you may well be doing so now. I don't know, maybe you have all moved since 3 weeks. But there is a hypocrisy here, you see what I'm talking about, by doing something and telling Africa that you cannot do it. You got to leave Africa the option on where to invest and how to make their investment. And so I don't see this thing changing. We are so much in debt. 70% of our earnings is used to service debt. So we are going camp in hand, begging to be given money to develop. And people are saying, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. And I do not see, despite some of the rhetorics, the placation, anybody really paying serious attention to African needs in the coming days in the negotiation. Remember, I told you the huge pledges have been made in terms of adaptation, and it is not eventuated in terms of actual transfer. So I worry that, and of course, if I'm speaking to African countries, I have a slightly different take to this. I blame them, I chide them on why they, and I ask them to get together and find their voice. But this is a global audience, and I am sort of defending the vulnerable here, saying there needs to be a strong coalition to change the system to accommodate more voices for Africa. And I don't see that happening currently.
Great, thanks. Helena, is there anything you would like to add?
Maybe to mention that there are some pressure groups and coalitions, like within the small island development states, for example, that they've talked in one voice and have been quite successful in pushing for some of their agendas in a global context. The vulnerable countries group were the ones who managed to get this 1.5 degree target written to the Paris Agreement, and they have also pushed for adaptation and let's say more the development capacity building parts of these agreements to be stronger. So they have but it's not, I agree with Chuck. So it's a different type of influence, if you want, and it's more as almost as a victim. It's the victimized type of voice that pushes the development, and it also builds very strongly on this, like the rich and the poor countries kind of conception that we still have, and it seems to be no going away from it. That's why I was mentioning that both the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, like, to me, one of the big strengths of it is that they're universal and they're supposed to be equal for all, which means that also developed countries and industrialized countries have similar requirements, should have, than what's often put on developing countries. I wanted to maybe mention the Belt and Road Initiative of China, One Belt, One Road. Maybe that in the future will have some influence beyond what it sees now, because it's a lot of money. And it's kind of a development bank type of effort that the Chinese are trying to put forward without the experience of that kind of multilateral banking system. And I know that there is a lot of discussions around the impact on environment that was not there from the beginning. So maybe in the future they could also be, because it's about money, investments, and going hand in hand with Africa and Asia, mainly developing countries. So let's see.
Thanks. Yeah, that was also something I was sort of aiming to get some perhaps some thinking about whether from those angles could be some constructive challenges. But I have one final question from Khadija, which I would like to ask both you, Helena and Chucks, to comment really in half a minute. The question is whether there are any messages for the COP26, and perhaps we could conclude with your take on those. Helena, why don't you? Okay, Chuck, go ahead.
Oh, I've already responded to Khadija's question by telling Khadija that COP26 is going to be catastrophic for Africa and the rest of the countries. And the simple reason is that if we go by what happened in the preparatory meeting 2 months ago, African delegation barely were able to make any significant impact because of network challenges, basic things. And now we haven't been able to get a concession from the UK that African delegation will be, there's going to be a concessionary vaccination program that will enable them to attend in session. So likely the best you can get in COP might be a hybrid sort of COP with some people on the ground, but a lot of people participating online. This will mean that Africa will not have the ability to really make its voice heard. And I'm a bit disappointed with the UK in a sense because this is a country that is talking about being global Britain, and yet at a time when Africa, as I said, have about 20 million or so being pushed into poverty as a result of COVID, UK has risen to cut the 0.7 official development assistance, which means that as I speak to you, more people are dying, more women are not able to, girls are not able to go to school, etc., etc. And this is not a good sign. And so unless there is some kind of miracle, which I think Khadija is hoping for, that can enable stronger participation from poor countries, I fear that what you're going to get is a focus on net zero, and even a kind of commitment that all countries and all nations and communities have to go to net zero, which will mean that Africa will be forced to leave the oil on the ground. Some people may argue this may be good for climate change, but it's not going to be good for the people. Thank you.
Right. Helena.
So very quickly, I would like to see more of the near-term mitigation strategies. As I mentioned on methane, for example, there's a lot on methane going on, which links to agriculture, oil and gas, the natural gas, and also waste being much higher on the agenda and included into much of the discussions on national determined contributions. And also the focus on health, because I agree also with Chuck, that it also the near-term impact on people's lives. So the economics of actions in the near term, which will contribute to the long-term objectives of the Paris Agreement, will be extremely important. And I think the UK and the COP26 could be a very good platform for that.
Thank you, Helena. So thank you both very much for your talks and also for the really interesting discussion. what I take away from it, as so often, is that the challenge for aligning agendas is not so much at the technical or scientific level as at the political level, and therefore embedded in existing power systems and systems of control. Thank you all very much. The time is up, and I would like to thank everyone for joining us, and especially our speakers, and say goodbye to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.